Alright, let's go ahead and get right into this. My opponent said we can't tell if we captured the true majority simply because we don't know what difference there was or how many actually voted. Now, I'm going to tell you today that we consider our elections in America to be the majority, to be legitimate elections. In the same way as what happened in Iraq, no, the entire population didn't vote, but there was still a significant majority. There was still a majority in terms of the people who voted for Alawi versus Maliki. So at that point, when it is termed a legitimate election, when the majority has voted, despite the fact that their lives were being threatened not to vote, and yet 62%, according to Washington Post, still showed up to vote in this election, it shows that they care about their elections. It shows that they care about their political climate, and they're ready for a change. They're ready for that dawning of the new day. He said that, according to CNN, Alawi doesn't favor either religious group. That's exactly what I'm saying, and that's why it's beneficial. That's what's going to help resolve this grudge between the Shiites and the Sunnis. The fact that Alawi doesn't favor either group. He doesn't favor either religious group because he favors secularism. And at the point when we have a middle ground, it's going to be easier to come past those grudges and move towards progress in Iraq and in Iraqi politics. He talked about the fact that it's considered an American appointee and that it's reported by the U.S., but the U.S. is not the only nation that has sanctified this election. The UN said that this was a legitimate election and claimed it to be a legitimate election in terms of what happened in the election in Iraq. So it's not just America that's supporting it, and it's not just America that's saying it's a good idea. It's the UN that's saying this is a legitimate election. In the past election, where there was supposedly a legitimate election, it was found out that UN went in and investigated, and it was not a legitimate election. But the UN is sanctifying this, yes, this is a legitimate election, and so therefore we can look towards that for change in Iraq. He said that we have to look at the character of Alawi. In 2007, he supported secularism, now he doesn't. The fact that the Iraqi people voted for him on his stance, the UNI party stance, which is what Alawi is the leader of, the UNI party stance, is for secularism. It's against theology. Alawi is a Western-trained doctor, and he has Western principles, and Western principles lead towards more secularism. So that shows innately in Alawi's philosophy that he leans towards secularism instead of philosophy. So we can see that that's going to be how he is going to vote, and that's how the Iraqi people voted for him. He said that all four political parties are calling for a manual recount. This is common practice in Iraq. In past elections, they have called for a manual recount simply because they aren't getting the desired outcome that they want. Alawi is a middle ground party man. He's a man who's going to affect change in Iraq, which is going to be different from anything that Iraqi people have known. So obviously the political leaders that did not win are going to call for a change. That's not significant reason to say that it's not going to have a political change. He said there's a Supreme Court case choosing the final winner. Once again, Alawi was chosen by a legitimate majority vote.
Before the clock starts, to everyone, thank you again for being here. And my final wish to you is that we all have a safe drive home, and I hope to see you all next week. I said I'll go ahead and start. The main key word today seems to be legitimate, whether or not this election was legitimate. So I'm going to harp on that very heavily with the negative last speech today. However, I'm going to go ahead and go down the flow as orderly as I can. And first she talks about the American election and says, well, we have legitimate elections and we sanctified it, so therefore it must be okay. The problem with this is that in the American climate, we don't have two very extreme religious groups, nor do we have sectarian violence at every corner. So to the point where we see that these two countries' political climates are very different, we cannot make the logical conclusion that because one is legitimate, the other one would be. We also don't have the rampant amount of corruption and things of that nature that Iraq has shown to have multiple times in the past, specifically with Mr. Alawi, whenever he was part of Saddam's bad party many years ago. And then we go on from that, and he says, and she gets the majority analysis again and says, well, the majority voted, and he won the majority. She doesn't give you the number of how he won the majority of the people in Iraq. Think about it logically, folks. If 62% of the people voted, and 13%, a pretty small number of them, voted for the other person, al-Maliki or any of the other candidates, then we cannot logically conclude that he captured the majority. Now, there are two different things we're talking about today. We're talking about the political politics in the government, and we're talking about the political climate. And we talked about both of these things. She's mentioned them in her speech. So, at the point we're dealing with this, we have to look at the Sunni and the Shiite once again. She offers you, again, no counter-argument as to how exactly this kind of shit is is going to overcome a 1,000-year grudge between the two. So, at that point, we cannot account to say that a new day has dawned for the Iraqi people. With the point where we can't verify if he has captured the majority of the vote of the people, but those people still have an effect on the political climate itself, we can logically conclude that this new day has not dawned. Then we go on to the off case. And she says, the Western principles lead to secularism, and he says, well, we had all of these sorts of Western principles. Then I ask you this, ladies and gentlemen, why is it 3 years ago, with the exact same Western principles, with the exact same Western training, that he wrote an article for the Washington Post saying that he supported or was against secularism? How was it 3 years ago? With the same training, mind you, the same stuff, he opposed it, and now he's for it. It makes no logical sense, regardless of how he leans, because we clearly understand that he has contradicted himself within 3 years. This shows a massive amount of lack of stability when we're dealing with this candidate, or when we're dealing with this supposed electorate. I'm a little flustered. So at that point, we have to understand that we cannot say a new day has dawned for this person, a new day has dawned for Iraq, because we do not know what he's going to do. At the point where 3 years ago, he was exactly against the platform he adopts now. There's no reason to say that he's going to stick with this. The only reason she gives you is that he is trained in Westernization. Yet with that same training, he's done both sides. We can clearly understand this doesn't make any sort of logical sense. And then we go on to the fact that the UN said the election was legitimate. Now I want to call attention to what she said right after that. She said in the previous election, the UN investigated and then found out that the election was illegitimate. She tells you in her first speech this election happened 2 days ago. There has been no time for the UN to investigate this election. And again, when we're talking about the resolution of facts, whether or not it has happened, if there isn't enough time to go investigate, if there isn't enough time to prove with the UN that this election is legitimate, then we cannot logically say, once again, that we should affirm today's resolution. Then we go on to the whole part about the recount is common. It doesn't matter if it's common or not. What we're talking about today are the facts. What is set in stone in the status quo? And the status quo, we don't even know if this election is legitimate because we have a recount. It doesn't matter if it's happened in the past because each recount actually recounts the votes. They don't look at historical precedent. They look at how many people showed up and how many people cast the ballot. All they're doing is double checking. But at the point where we're doing this double check, at the point where we're going back and recounting every ballot, because there is contestation from 4 opposing political parties, then we cannot say once again that this new day has dawned. She can't answer for the cultural backlash of the 66 guy. She can't answer for the fact that he has switched sides within 3 years. She can't answer for the fact that there isn't enough time to investigate, and she cannot answer for the fact that the recount is still going on. So for all of these reasons, the new day has not dawned, and I urge for a negative ballot, and hope you all have a safe ride.
I want to start off by just saying thank you to everyone once again for this wonderful opportunity and for being here today. And congratulations to you all. Now everyone's excited to get to the award ceremony, so let's go ahead and begin. My opponent says that Americans don't have extreme religions. It's not the same political party, so therefore there can't be a correlation made. No, Americans don't have religious parties running the politics, but we do have 2 different politics parties. We do have 2 different groups. And at the point when it's a democratic process election, and even though the entire population of the United States doesn't vote in the election, yet we still count a majority as being a legitimate election, then we can therefore correlate that in Iraq this was a legitimate election. He said that we can't tell how much he won the majority by, or by what margin, so how do you know that he was truly elected by the majority of the population? 62% of Iraqis voted in this election, despite the fact that their lives were being threatened. So they obviously showed that they were for the legitimacy of the politics and for changing politics. This shows that Iraqis want a change in the politics because the majority of people voted for the UNI party, put the UNI party in the majority majority that said we want more Western principles, we want more secularist principles, we want more legitimacy in our elections, and we want more you and I politics. This is the majority of people who voted for this party that stands for Western principles. That is why the election was legitimate, and that is why we can tell that this is what the Iraqi people want, and why a new day has dawned. He said, I can't prove how they are going to overcome this religious grudge. The whole point of how they are going to overcome this religious grudge is that Alawi stands for neither religious party. He's a middle ground. He's of the you and I party. He's neither a Sunni nor a Shiite. Neither does he stand for either religious party. So at the point when he presents a middle ground, it will be easier for them to overcome their own grudges and move towards this middle ground. Said, why do the Western principles prove that 3 years ago he voted in a different election? We're not simply talking about Alawi in terms of the way that he has spoken and the way he has voted. We were talking about the entire party, the party that Alawi represents, the you and I party that Alawi represents, the party that stands for Westernism, centralism, legitimacy in election, and for Western policies. And we can see that through the legitimacy of this election, they are moving more towards these policies and towards a new day in terms of politics for the Iraqis. He said that the UN said that the election was legitimate, but there's no time to investigate. So how can we know that this is actually legitimate? The whole point I was making with past elections is with this election, the UN doesn't even have any speculation as to whether or not the election was legitimate. They have already sanctioned the election as being legitimate. There are no pending investigations. There are no worries. There are no speculations as to the legitimacy of the election. They have already sanctioned this election as being legitimate. So we can see that because the UN has sanctioned it, because a majority of the people voted in this election, and the fact that a majority of people voted for more Western and secularist principles, more legitimacy in their elections, more policy that leans towards the Western principles, we can see that truly a new day has dawned for Alawi. Thank you.